Building the Death Star probably required a ton of new tools and techniques. While some of those are still in a galaxy far, far away, I did add a few more to my shop to make today's build possible. I just hope this project doesn't blow up like Alderaan. I've always been a huge fan of Star Wars and the lore behind the franchise. So today I want to build a table that pulls elements from the films and showcases them in a way that I haven't seen before. To do that, I plan to use some new techniques coupled with a few new gadgets to achieve a table that glows like a lightsaber and adds some light to the darker side of the Force, or at least in my case, to my movie room. The first step in my journey to join the Empire is to mill down my lumber for the tabletop, sides, and base. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let's take a look at what the top is going to look like. So the top is going to be comprised of a few different ring layers, and each of those layers is going to get a slightly different treatment depending on where they are in the stack. The bottom portion will get a clear section to allow for light to emit from the edge, while the top of the table will have an area for some glowing inlaid art and a glass tabletop. The tricky part is going to be cutting the rabbets and circles perfectly so that everything aligns in the end and the art, glass, and top come together correctly. And sticking with the dark side theme, I decided to use black walnut for this build. Maybe one day I'll make a contrasting light side version with maple or white oak. I don't know. We'll see. Once I have the sticks cut down to more manageable slices, I can head over to the joiner. Here I'm going to flatten one face and one edge of all my boards. Occasionally I'll let you guys know that this step isn't super important for one reason or another, but with this project I need my boards to be perfectly square. So I paid extra attention during the milling process so I didn't end up with a wobbly star base. With the boards fresh off the joiner, I next headed over to my planer to thickness them down to their final thickness. Now, I'll say final thickness kind of loosely here because I'm going to actually go about a 32nd of an inch over my final thickness. This way I have a little bit of room for sanding. The good thing is that with this project, I don't have a ton of referential measuring to do, so if my material is off one way or another, it's not going to make or break the build. I'd much rather have flat, smooth boards than rely solely on my Death Star plan, exhaust ports included. Once I have the table saw set up, I can go ahead and rip down all of my boards. So my table is going to consist of 3 separate rings to achieve my glowing effects. And to make those rings consistent and even, I need to trim down my boards evenly and consistently. Once I've ripped them all down to the rough width needed for cutting my rings, I can go ahead and pop on my crosscut sled, then trim the tree slices down to their rough length. I want to make sure that I have plenty of material to cut the miters for the rings, so here I'm aiming for the boards to be a ½ an inch longer than my final dimension. To ensure I have consistent grain with my boards, I try to trim them down and stack them in order. Now, it's probably not super important for every aspect of this project, since some of these rings are going to be laminated together. And because of that, you're not going to see the grain pattern anyway. But it's good practice to stay organized this way, and if you want to grain match parts later on, it's a lot easier to do so. Now that we're done with the rough milling, I can move on to refining my parts. So the next step is to pop in my crosscut blade and set up my miter sled. Since I'm cutting circles from these boards, I first want to create 3 hexagons. It's also a happy coincidence that the hexagon is plastered all over the place in the Star Wars universe, so I feel like this subtly plays off the theme. Yep, I've got a good feeling about this. So to make my hexagonal shapes, I'm going to set my fence to 30 degrees, because 30 degrees times 12 cuts is 360, which maths to a circle. Once I make my initial cut, I'll flip my board over and put my miter against my stop, then make my second cut. As long as all my settings are correct and all my boards are the same length and width, the result will be a perfect hexagon. Now, if you do have something off in your measurements, and when it comes time to assemble your parts the hexagon is off, you can probably cheat one angle a little bit to help things line up. I've had to do that in the past when my parts were off by a degree or so don't think all hope is lost if you line up your joints and there's a gap larger than the trench run. Instead, try trimming off a small amount off 2 adjacent angles that align across from each other on the hexagon. I recommend making those adjustments about a ½ degree at a time. And if you find these tips helpful and you're enjoying this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the video out, and I greatly appreciate your support. With my remaining boards marked out, I'll flip on the hyperdrive while I knock out those miters. Back at the bench, it's time to glue up my hexagons. So what I'll first do is apply 2 strips of blue tape to each of my miters, being sure to stretch the tape across the joint so that it pulls it nice and tight. While these won't be the only clamping pressure I use for these joints, the strips do help keep things aligned throughout the process. From there, I'll flip the assembly over and apply a bit of glue to each joint. Once I have glue spread evenly in the miters, I use a strap clamp to squeeze them into submission. Now, since applying clamping pressure with the strap clamp can be slightly uneven, I like to clamp my workpieces down to my bench top to ensure all my parts remain flat. Once I've knocked out my 2 lower rings, I'll go ahead and follow that same process for the tabletop. But being that this is a larger panel, I do apply a bit more pressure so that the force is strong with this one. Oh boy. After about an hour in clamps, I'll go ahead and pop the hexagons out and give them all a quick sanding. Since I want these to remain pretty flat, I'm not going to use a ton of pressure when sanding these pieces. Instead, I'm just trying to remove any glue squeeze out and rough up the surface a bit for my laminations. For any cracks or voids that are present, I'll just use a bit of epoxy mixed with some black dye to fill in those gaps. When I laid out the boards early on, I made sure to place any problem areas towards the center. This way those areas would be hidden when I cut the inner circles. The next step was to trim down my first acrylic core. So I'll just trace the shape of my lower hexagon onto the outer film and use a jigsaw to cut it out. This acrylic layer is the first step in achieving that lightsaber glow I'm going for. But I have another Jedi mind trick up my sleeve coming later on. Once I have my outer hexagon cut, I can find the center point and trim out the middle. My goal here is just to rough out the shape of the hexagon. I don't need things to be perfect because I'm going to end up cutting my entire hexagon sandwich out at the same time, so I don't need my pieces to line up at this point. In fact, I'd argue that a little overhang is better than none, since parts can shift a lot during a lamination glue up. Now, the thing about acrylic is that the exterior is super smooth, so I'm going to need to rough it up a bit for my adhesive to stick properly. And that's done pretty easily with some 180 grit in the random orbit sander. Again, this is another one of those situations where light pressure is needed, as I don't want to introduce any indentations into my sheet. From there, it's on to the epoxy. Epoxy is probably the best adhesive for plexiglass or acrylic because it dries clear and super hard, much like acrylic itself. So once I've mixed up a batch, I'll use a sponge roller to apply the epoxy to one side of each of my hexagons. I like to use a scrap piece to roll out a slab to help me evenly distribute the epoxy on the roller. This way, I don't oversaturate any one area of my substrate. I do want to make sure that I have an even coat of epoxy on each workpiece, but epoxy doesn't absorb the same way that PVA glue does, so a thin layer is all I really need. Once I have both pieces coated, I'll pop in my acrylic layer, then top it with my second hexagon. From there, a few strips of blue tape help hold things mostly in place. Once I'm happy with the alignment, I'll take my galactic sandwiches over to the vacuum press to freeze them in place like Han Solo in carbonite. And I guess this is as good a time as any to tell you guys that Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, is by far my favorite film in the series. But I know everyone has a different favorite, so let's end this debate. Let me know down in the comments what your favorite Star Wars movie is, and if you start your comment with your favorite film, I'll be sure to reply to you guys first because I know you're paying attention. At the end of the month, I'll tally up the results and post them so we know who the clear winner is. I left the epoxy to cure overnight, and the next day I could come back in the shop and remove my lamination from the vacuum bag. And thankfully this time around, everything worked out just fine. Next, it was on to fabricating a quick trammel arm or two. I know there are a ton of jigs on the market for router trammels, but I find it easiest just to use a couple of pieces of scrap 1/2-inch plywood to make my own. So the first step is to mark out the mounting location for my router, and I'm going to try to center that on my piece of scrap. From there I'll pop in a couple of holes for mounting bolts, and then use a countersink bit to ease the edges before attaching the router and plunging the center hole. The edges of my 1/2-inch center are going to dictate my inner and outer diameters, so it's important that I mark those as accurately as possible. So when I measure out the radius for my circles, I'll go from the center point to either the outer diameter or the inner diameter depending on my need. Since I'm going to be cutting thicker stock here, I'll make a quick center block to offset my mounting hole at the middle. Once I've plunged 4 mounting holes along with a center hole over at the drill press, I'll again use a countersink bit to ease the top edges for my fasteners. From there, I can center my center block on my sacrificial piece and mount it in place. Next, I just need to center my hexagon lamination on my sacrificial board, and then I can mark out my radius and test the position of my trammel arm. It's a good idea to use a pencil to double check your radius before you make the cuts. So once I was happy with the outside diameter, I could go ahead and attach my router and cut the inside rabbet for the bottom of my table. This is one of those situations where the order of operations is super important. If I don't cut the rabbet first, it's going to be a heck of a lot more difficult to do it later on. So my first cut is going to be the inner rabbet, followed by the inside circle, and then finally the outer. Now, as I work my way around the workpiece, I'm lowering my bit by 1/4 inch each pass. If I try to take too much at one time, I run the risk of my router running away from me, given the fact that I'm using a climb cut here. Typically, you want to work left to right when the router's in the upright position so that you cut against the spin of the bit. But because my trammel arm is held in place by a screw, I want to use a left to right or clockwise feed direction so my fastener doesn't remove itself. So after about 10 passes, both my inner and outer circles are cut, and I can pop my base off and move on to the tabletop. Here I'm going to follow the exact same process where I cut my rabbet for the glass insert first, then my inside circle, followed by the outer. Pro tip, if you have a difficult time removing your workpiece from a template or sacrificial surface when using double stick tape, I find plastic spreaders to be a great wedge to pop them free, and they won't damage your workpieces. With my workpiece free from the resistance, my first order was to assemble my parts and see how things were coming together. Yep, this is the way. Confident about my base, I can next move on to gluing up the bottom insert for my table. And that's just going to come together like all panel assemblies do, with some glue and a few clamps. I was careful here, however, to make sure that this panel ended up super flat. So I added a few F-style clamps to the edges of my joints and tossed on a few clamping cauls to keep things level. So while the glue cures, I can move on to cleaning up the edges of my rings. And I'll start by sanding my interior circles with an oscillating spindle sander. From there, I'll bring the rings over to the bench to finish hand sanding them. Here, I want to use a pretty stiff sanding block so I don't introduce a convex shape along the edges. This is also why I didn't route a rabbet onto the underside of my tabletop. When sanding parts like this, I'm inevitably going to introduce some unevenness to my ring, so rather than having those gaps be exposed in the joinery, I just think it's better to have an edge to face grain joint that I can just clean up later on. With the sanding on the tabletop and the lower rings complete, I can remove the clamps from the panel and give it the old RO treatment before attaching it to my sacrificial board and cutting it down. Again here, this setup's going to be the same as the other rings, so let's hyperdrive through that. Punch it, Chewie. And I gotta tell you, there's nothing quite as satisfying as a perfect piston fit. Impressive. Next up was the edge treatments. So over at the router table, I'm going to use an 1/8 inch roundover bit to ease the edges of my tabletop and bottom of the outside base piece. I don't want to round over the top edge of my base piece because that's where my glue joint's going to go, and we want that to be nice and flat. From there, I can head over to the drill press to plunge in a hole so that I can feed the LED wiring through the base. Finally, it was time to glue the bottom of the base into place and then adhere the base to the tabletop. Here, I was careful to use a minimal amount of glue so that I don't have a ton of squeeze out to clean up. Unfortunately, because these round parts are a little bit more difficult to work with, I'm not able to route a glue groove in like I did for the last project. So squeeze out is something I'm going to have to deal with here. To pin the top to the base, I'll just use a few 23 gauge brad nails. And this is as good a time as any to introduce you guys to my new tool, which makes this entire project possible, the Ufimake UV Printer E1. Ufimake was kind enough to sponsor this video and allow me to bring this project to life. This printer is small in size and big on print, with a footprint of only 20 by 16 inches and a printing area of A3 or just over 16.5 by 13 inches. The cool thing is, because it's a modular print bed, there's different size beds for different size projects. And because this is a UV printer, you can print on pretty much any material. The printer can also create 3D textures up to 5mm, and the software it comes with makes that super easy. Now, since the goal of this project is to embrace the light, or actually dark side, I'm going to be printing on a few acrylic sheets. And what better subject matter for a coffee table build than the building of the second Death Star? Yep, there was 2 of them. Aligning your artwork to the substrate is super easy because the printer has a few built-in lasers to help you get a perfect fit. Now, I'll be completely honest with you guys and tell you that this is my first UV printer I've owned. And I was thrilled to find that the learning curve for using a printer like this was pretty minimal. Once you insert the 6 ink cartridges and fire the printer up, it takes about 15 minutes before you're off to the races. And as far as print time goes, the large panels you see printing here only took about 30 minutes each. But because I'm using acrylic, when I go to light my project internally, it's going to create a 3-dimensional glowing effect for my tabletop. So once you turn the printer on, it'll warm up by moisturizing the ink heads, and then it will do a self-clean, which is nice because I've heard maintaining a UV printer can be a nightmare. But with the Just Clean feature, Eufy Make has made that pretty painless, and the print quality you get from the printer is astonishingly good. As I mentioned earlier, the software itself is super easy to use and pretty intuitive for anyone who's familiar with design software. It's also worth noting that this is a very safe UV printer, and that it's Green Guard Gold certified for low VOCs, which as a woodworker is super important to me. I also like the fact that once the printer is set up, I can just go on about my work and there's not really anything I have to do to manage the print cycle. Yeah, unlike the Skywalkers, I myself am pretty low maintenance. So after about an hour, both of my prints were done and I could check out how they came together. That's no moon. To protect my Death Star from attacks of the liquid variety, I decided to print out a textured coaster of the V1 model. Now, as I mentioned, you can print textures up to about 5mm with this printer, so the possibilities are about as expansive as a galaxy far, far away. Another cool aspect of this printer is that it comes with a rotary attachment for printing on cylindrical surfaces. So while I had everything out, I went ahead and popped in a water bottle to generate a quick print for my son. Again here, the software is going to scan my object and give me a 3-dimensional view of my vessel. From there, I can make any necessary adjustments and then hit print. Now, in hindsight, I probably should have shortened the height of my design a bit, but to be honest, I'm not mad at the full bleed version. Plus, it also showcases that this printer can print on just about any surface. To round out the printer's capabilities, I also wanted to showcase how it prints direct to film. Eufy Make offers direct to film sheets you can pop on their smaller bed and print out your own stickers or decals in no time. And once your film's printed, you can pop your work onto the laminator and trim them out. The Eufy Make UV Printer E1 is still currently in the Kickstarter phase, and they're offering an early bird discount. So if you're interested in getting one for yourself, check out the link down in the description. Thanks again to Eufy Make for sponsoring this video and allowing me to bring the dark side of the Force to light. So back over at the workbench, I needed to align the 2 Death Star halves, and I used some blue tape to hold my pieces together. From there, I used some stencil film to help protect the printed surface. I'm going to be using double-sided tape to hold my workpieces down to my sacrificial board, so in theory, this stencil film should prevent the print from being ripped off from the much stickier 2-sided tape. With my overall diameter in hand, I marked out the location for the center of the panel, then adjusted my trammel arm accordingly and attached it to my sacrificial top sheet. Again here, I'll just cut my circle using the same method as before. Now, I printed my art out on acrylic first because I felt like it was a little bit easier to get things aligned that way, being that I had a bit of bleed built into the print. Even still, I needed my actual circle to be pretty perfect for the design to work. So it was a big relief when I dropped it in place and it seated tighter than an X-Wing on Dagobah. From there, I could give the circle a light sanding to clean up the edges. As I mentioned a moment ago, the theory was that the stencil film would protect my art without ripping it away. But that was about as accurate as Anakin being the savior, because when I went to remove the film, it took my art right along with it.
No! Well, don't do it like that. I think I have another plan though.
And thankfully for me, that other plan means just printing my art again using the E1. Now, it's important to note that this mistake isn't the fault of the printer, and that when printing on smooth surfaces like glass or acrylic, a UV primer will help with adhesion, and Eufy Make will be offering one of those soon. But because the E1 can adjust to any material orientation, you can pretty accurately print on any shape you want. All I had to do was align my artwork, scale it slightly larger than my material, and then hit print. I had a feeling I might have to do this, but I still thought it was worth the risk of trying to print prior to cutting my half moons. Oh well. Unlike the Galactic Empire, I won't make that mistake again. So now my own second Death Star is finally assembled, which is kind of apropos. And now instead of building a moon base, I'm on to building the table base. In sticking with the theme of hexagons, I'm going to build my base in a pedestal fashion. I want the pedestal to taper from top to bottom, kind of like you're looking into the Imperial logo. The real tricky part in this section is going to be getting all these miters to align perfectly, given that they also taper, which could be a trap, so I need to plan my attack carefully. Thank you, Admiral. So my first step here is to lay out my tapers from top to bottom, then from there I'll lay out my bevel joints. Now, because these miters are going to taper from top to bottom as well as be beveled, they're going to be compound miters. So the first step is to cut a sled with my bevel in place, and I'll just do that over at the table saw. Now, over the years on the channel I've shown quite a few sleds being built, so I'm just going to kind of breeze through this one. But basically I'm going to align the edge of my workpiece with the edge of my cut, then use a few reference blocks to align my board. From there, a couple hold down clamps will keep my parts secure while I make the cuts. Since I have to do mirroring angles, I'm going to do all my cuts on one side first, then remake a new sled to do the cuts on the adjoining side. Throughout this process, it's important that I be as accurate as I can, because any discrepancies in my angles or setup are going to be on full display when these joints come together. So once I was confident with the layout on my second sled, I could head back over to the table saw to cut in those bevels. With the 6 sides of my hollow table base cut to form, I could attach some strips of blue tape and do a quick dry assembly. Yeah, I am pleased. Now, due to the compound miters, the top and bottom ends of my baseboards no longer run parallel to the ground. So back over at the table saw, I'll tilt my blade to match the vertical angle of my base, then use my miter sled to cut the bevels horizontally. The only problem here is that I've already trimmed off the side angles from my workpieces, so I'm just going to use a couple of offcuts to hold my workpieces square to the blade while I make the cuts. This is why it's super important to never throw away your offcuts when you're working with miters or bevels, because like Jar Jar, you never know when they're going to be useful. Over at the drill press, I can next plunge in a hole for the power cord to feed through the side of the base. And I'm just going to do that with a 3/4 inch bit that I have offset from the bottom edge. Here I am careful not to go all the way through my workpiece in one pass to avoid tear out. So after I make it most of the way on one side, I'll flip my workpiece over and finish the procedure from the other side. From there it's on to sanding the base up to 180 grit, and I'll do that with the random orbit sander. Here I'm more focused on the interior sections than the exterior, as I can sand those once the glue up is completed. With my parts feeling smoother than a pod racer, it was time to glue up the base. Again here I'm going to rely on blue tape to hold all of my joints nice and tight during the glue up. So what I want to focus on is making sure I'm stretching my blue tape tight across my joint and then adding a strip along its entirety. If this is done properly and your joinery is cut correctly, the clamping pressure you get from blue tape is more than enough to hold your miters together. Once I've applied glue to each joint, I'll throw on an F-style clamp and use a piece of scrap to help hold things flat while the glue cures. After about 2 hours, I could remove all the blue tape and give the exterior a quick sanding. And though I don't focus on it here, I did work on cleaning up the interior quite a bit, even though no one's ever really going to see that part. Next it's on to inlaying my brass brand, so for that I'll use my router and a quick template. A little bit of CA glue holds the brand in place with a grip that even Vader would envy. Next, it's on to the figure 8 fasteners that will secure the tabletop to the base. So what I'll first do is mark out the rough-ish location for each one of the fasteners. My plan here is just to use 3 figure 8 fasteners in a triangle sequence. So once I have my initial mortise in place, I'll just use my chisels to remove a bit of extra material and then pop in the fastener. Satisfied with the location, I'll use a self-centering drill bit to drive in the pilot hole. From there, all that's needed is a 1/2-inch screw to secure the fasteners. To align the base to the center of the top, I'm just going to use the eyeball test and look down the center of the base to get it pretty close. From there, I'll just stand back and use the force. No targeting computer needed here. Next, we're on to the finish. And for the finish on this hollow table, I'll be using a hard wax oil, which should be able to stand up to all that space debris. So while I finish up the finish, allow me to take a moment to say thank you for watching, commenting, and supporting the channel. I design, build, and film all these projects on nights and weekends, so having the support from you guys means the world. That said, if you want to support the show further, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes on plans and merchandise, and an invite to the Discord server where we can chat about all things woodworking. So if you'd like to see more behind the scenes and access to things you just can't get through YouTube alone, check out the link in the description. And as always, to those of you who have already joined, thank you so much for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. So with the finish completed, all that was left was to wire up the LEDs. This set comes with 2 rolls for plenty of light, plus I added a couple of L connectors to help me distribute them evenly. Once I have the LEDs in place, all I have to do is attach a fancier extension cord, drop in my acrylic artwork, slide on the glass top, and this table is ready for battle. Alright Padawans of the planer, the Death Star hollow table is officially lit, literally and figuratively. And I gotta tell ya, I haven't had this much fun on a project since Palpatine died. The second time. The 3 concentric walnut rings, lightsaber bright acrylic core, and pedestal base that's more hexagonal than the Imperial logo make this table a serious talking point. Between the vacuum press laminations, compound miter sled wizardry, and the UV printed Death Star art glowing under the glass, every inch of this build flexes a new trick I've been itching to try. I'm stoked at how elegant it turned out too. Continuous grain wrapping the rings creates a balanced, intentional look, while the lightsaber glow of the outer ring and illuminated top injects pure energy into this minimalist form. So if this build sparked your creativity, check out this video next. Subscribe for more woodworking shenanigans, and as always I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.